former colleagues of Paul Manafort. There are also multiple reports now, get this, just reporting this now, multiple reports that the controversial deputy assistant to the president, Sebastian Gorka, has just resigned from the White House. This is an individual who has been controversial, to say the least, whose expertise is unclear, whose job is unclear. It was unclear whether he even had security clearance. He mostly appeared to go on television. A former Breitbart contributor, Sebastian Gorka, appears to have resigned. At least multiple reports are saying that right now. The panel is still with me. Naveed, I don't know if you have strong feelings about Sebastian Gorka. I know many people do. He was a Scaramucci-like figure, has been a Scaramucci-like figure for different reasons, different politics in Scaramucci, but let's just say flamboyant in a certain way. What do you make of that news?
Well, I think it's an insult to Scaramucci to compare him to Scaramucci. I think, look, first of all, it should be noted that there are actually two Gorkas in the White House. His wife is still very much in the administration, and I am concerned that she stays on. Sebastian Gorka, from everything that from his PhD advisor, he's not someone who is a terrorism expert. Nonetheless, he was involved in the White House. It's unclear that he actually did anything because, as far as we can tell, he never had a security clearance. So his ability to actually come in and influence policy, while that might have been there on the TV side, I'm not so sure actually what he did. Clearly, as Richard Painter and Jill have said, he was a polarizing figure in the sense that there's an appeal to this fringe element of white supremacists and Nazis, and clearly Sebastian Gorka had an appeal to them. I mean, he was someone who was caught wearing, if I recall correctly, a symbol that harked back to the sort of Hungarian Nazi connection. And it's just these are not the people that we need in the White House representing our government.
Mr. McLaughlin, as someone who's talking